I've spent the last 3 months talking about why people avoid certain yarns for warp and how to get away with these so-called tricky or off-limits warp yarns. In today's video, I'm going to wrap up this series with a quick review, plus we're going to talk about one category of yarn that we haven't talked about yet. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Number one is the strength of yarn. A lot of people, when they start weaving, think that warp yarn needs to be super strong, so strong that you can't even break it. Well, first of all, this is a really unrealistic standard because everybody has a different amount of hand strength. I can easily break with my own hands an 8/4 cotton rug warp, which is considered a really strong yarn. So that whole standard is just kind of bunk. Now, it is true that yarn is going to be under a lot of tension and it's going to be subject to a lot of abrasion, so it does need to be strong, but it just needs to be strong enough. Remember that you're not warping just one thread. You're warping tens or even hundreds or up to 1,000 or more warp ends, and together they share their strength with their neighbors. This is really the foundation for everything else that I talk about in this series. So if you're new, be sure and give that video a watch. It's going to be linked above as well as in the description below. Number two is hand spun yarn as warp. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, "Oh, you're so brave to use your hand spun yarn as warp." Well, I don't get it, to be honest. Yes, it is time and labor intensive to spin all the yarn yourself and then to warp the loom and to weave it, but it's really, really rewarding. There are some issues and concerns with waste, so you definitely do want to make sure and sample before you warp a big hand spun project. And it's important to use your hand spun yarn wisely because of the time and effort that goes into making it. But people have been weaving with hand spun yarn for as long as people have been making cloth. It's literally the origin of woven cloth. In my video on handspun warp, I talk more about the history behind all of this, as well as things that you want to look out for when you're making your own handspun yarn for warp. Number three is all about singles. No, I'm not talking about the kind you date, I'm talking about the yarn. When we talk about plies, a singles is one ply of yarn. It doesn't have 2 plies or 3 plies or 4 plies. Each time you add a ply to a yarn, it becomes stronger. So single ply is inherently the weakest yarn you could possibly have. But that doesn't mean that it's too weak for warp yarn. In fact, there are some single ply yarns out there that are insanely strong. It all has to do with fiber content, how the yarn is spun, and how it's finished when the spinning is done. But even shorter, weaker fibers like cotton can be spun tightly enough that they will be strong enough for warp. There are other things that you can do like sizing, and I go into all of this in my video on singles as warp. Number four is linen. This is maybe one of the most persistent things that circulates around the weaving world, is that linen is hard to weave with. There are some reasons that would back this up, having to do with the structure of its the fiber and how it behaves. It's notoriously inelastic, it's sensitive to humidity changes, and it's also fairly prone to abrasion. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't weave with it. In my warping with linen video, I talk about some of the ways that you can work around the specific challenges of linen and create a really beautiful cloth. 5 is one of my favorites, and it is all about warping with knitting yarn. I think this topic causes a lot of consternation because there are weavers who started out as weavers and all they know is weaving yarn, and then there are weavers who started out as knitters like I did, and I had a lot of experience with knitting yarn, and I had a huge stash of knitting yarn when I started weaving, and I didn't want to go out and buy all this new yarn that I didn't know how to work with. So I happily jumped into weaving with knitting yarns as warp, and I still do. Having said that, there are some interesting differences between yarns that are sold for weavers and yarns that are sold for knitters, and it really starts at the spinning mill with how the yarn is made. In my video about warping with knitting yarn, I take you through all of these differences and walk you through what to look out for if you want to warp with knitting yarn. I think this is a really valuable resource because it's something we just don't talk about enough. So be sure and check it out. Number 6 is all about textured and slubby and fuzzy yarns. There's this idea out there that you can't use them as warp, that they should only be in your weft. There's some truth to this because they're going to be more prone to breakage, snagging on parts of your loom as you weave. And if you're looking for an easy, streamlined weaving experience going really fast, this is a type of yarn you might want to avoid in your warp. But you can get some really interesting effects if you do use it in your warp, and I walk you through all the things that you need to look out for in the video on that topic. Number 7, yarn. So this whole series that we've been talking about yarn, but what is yarn in the first place? We usually think of it as this fibrous material that's sort of cylindrical, but you don't have to use yarn. You could use really anything that you could send through your loom. Wire, paper, or you could even use tape from a cassette tape or a videotape. The whole point of this series has been to help you think about the qualities of the materials that you use. Does it stretch? Is it strong? Does it hold up to tension and abrasion? That's really the key when you're using something as warp on a loom. Even if it doesn't meet all the requirements, a lot of times there are modifications you can make either to the warp itself or to your loom to let you weave with it. My point is, there are no weaving police. There are just helpful and well-meaning people who are hoping to save you a little bit of heartache. But if you're willing to take a risk, experiment, and know that you might need to do some adjusting along the way, know that you could have an unlimited array of options for your warp. What I've done with this series is I've collected it all into a single playlist that will appear at the end screen at the end of this video. It's a really great resource. It includes all of the videos, all of these topics, as well as some short videos that dive deeper into very specific examples, including things on the loom, so you'll know what to look out for and things that you can do to work around specific challenges. I'm also going to be publishing an ebook soon with pictures and step-by-step instructions. So if the written word is easier for you to digest, or you just want to have that resource on hand all the time, be sure to go to my website and sign up for my newsletter so that you'll be the first to hear about it when it's ready. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.